Welcome to the Progressive American. My name is Connor Kelly, a freelance writer, political commentator, and most of all, the proud host of this bi-weekly podcast, where I discuss the nation's news from a progressive perspective, and with new, informative guests on every show. Today I'm talking about the arrest of Steve Bannon, Darren Bailey's campaign struggles against Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, and the Ukrainian counterattack. Finally, I discuss the midterm elections with Dr. Matthew Geras from the University of Illinois, Springfield. With that out of the way, let's get into the news. Earlier this Thursday, former Trump advisor and notorious conspiracy theorist Steve Bannon was arrested on charges of money laundering, conspiracy, and scheme to defraud. Bannon had previously faced charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, but was able to avoid conviction thanks to a last-minute pardon by then-President Donald Trump. Bannon has also been convicted on charges of contempt of Congress, for which he will be sentenced in October. Now, it's worth noting that the basis for this investigation is not a federal-level investigation. It's a state-level, meaning that the federal pardon that Trump gave to Bannon will not protect him from any other form of prosecution related to a similar case when it has to deal with state statutes. Effectively meaning that Bannon is without any protection or support from the government or a pardon by the former president. More specifically, however, I think it's important to note that Bannon is specifically being investigated for his involvement in a fundraising scheme for a wall, specifically a wall at the Mexican border. For those who don't remember, Bannon was one of several people who was involved in this idea that if the government wasn't going to use money to build the wall at the border and to keep out undocumented immigrants, that they would basically do it for them. Of course, that didn't end up working out, and it is worth noting that the indictment against Bannon also names the very organization that he worked with as the chair of its advisory board. The organization known as We Build the Wall Incorporated seemingly had multiple payments made throughout its time in 2019 to Bannon and his allies through various organizations under Bannon's control. If convicted, Bannon could face up to 43 years in prison, as well as issues with parole. Though it's worth noting that Bannon has pled not guilty and has been very publicly defiant that the attack or the investigation into him has been nothing more than a political hit job, as evidenced by the perp walk appearance he made on his way to arraignment.
For every conservative American, this is what happens in the last days of a dying regime. They will never shut me up. They'll have to kill me first. I have not yet begun to fight.
Of course, it's not entirely surprising that a conspiracy theorist would bring up this idea of victimization or martyrdom. Bannon is wildly unpopular, wildly unhinged, and completely divorced from reality 99% of the time. His white nationalist politics, his conspiracy theories about the end times have always been a motivating part of his rhetoric. So it's not really that surprising that any limitation on his power or any limitation on his conduct would provoke such a vitriolic response. There's nothing inherently surprising about what he does. But it's worth noting that the same victimhood mentality that the establishment is out to get you, that they're there to throw you away for being conservative, is just part of common Republican rhetoric now. Here's a scam artist who appealed to the prejudices and fears of millions of people, scammed them of their money, and then could never deliver what he promised since he had no authority over the border. And yet, when he faces consequences for his actions, he pretends that he's the victim, that he's being harmed because he's the one with principles when he's the one who has absolutely none. And it is not just Bannon. It's people like Mike Lindell, who has claimed that the FBI raided him by taking his phone or confiscating his materials when he's under investigation for his conduct and contributing to the big lie and threatening to overturn the election. It's all of them. Consequences when it comes to the Trump leadership and the Trump movement is something that is foreign to them. It's evil. It's the enemy to them. And while I would not say that this applies to all Republicans, the fact that this is common parlance for Republican leadership when they are faced with an investigation that points out their corruptions against the very people they are supposed to represent is telling about the condition of the Republican Party at large. Bannon was hailed as a hero of patriots and Americans who cared about the country, but he doesn't care about any of you. All he cares about is what he can do to advance his career, and now he's facing the consequences of his actions. In electoral news, J.B. Pritzker appears to have chosen his opponent well, as the Republican nominee for the governorship has bungled and struggled his way through his campaign. Despite receiving an estimated $1 million from a conservative megadonor, Darren Bailey's campaign is struggling to keep up with the Democratic incumbent. In funding alone, Pritzker has significantly more gas to support his campaign, putting nearly $90 million into his re-election as of January 2022, according to Bloomberg News. But funding is the least of Darren Bailey's concerns. Multiple scandals have popped up as previous bigoted comments by the Republican candidate and his staff were brought to light. According to Crane's Chicago Business, Bailey has previously posted several negative comments about Islam, transgender rights, and much more. Nor was it the first time that Bailey had gotten himself into hot water over his rhetoric. In a 12-minute video posted to Facebook in 2017, then candidate for state senate Bailey said, quote, "I believe that abortion is one of the greatest atrocities of our day, and I believe it's one of the greatest atrocities probably ever. The attempted extermination of the Jews of World War II doesn't even compare on a shadow of the life that has been lost with abortion since its legalization," end quote. Now, I don't think I need to tell you how that is inappropriate and unacceptable, especially when you consider that Bailey's opponent is a Jewish man. But it's still worth saying. Comparing a genocide to a woman's right to choose, or better yet, a woman's desire to protect herself from having to endure a pregnancy as a product of rape, which again, Darren Bailey opposes, is completely and utterly unacceptable and inappropriate, not to mention anti-Semitic. It's one thing if you are a pro-life person and you feel that the lives of these children, so to speak, are worth protecting with the foot of law behind it. That's fine. That's your prerogative. But don't compare a genocide to your position or attempt to hold that position over other people, especially when many of the victims of that horrible event are still alive today. It's also worth noting that Darren Bailey has a tendency to get into some weird, very dehumanizing language, not just about his opponents, but about the people in entire communities. He's repeatedly referred to Chicago as a hellhole. He's repeatedly attempted to appeal to the issues of crime as if Chicago is overflowing with crooks and murderers. It is perhaps that dehumanizing language which is likely contributing to his failure as a campaign. According to 538, most of the campaign polling and projections show that Darren Bailey is behind J.B. Pritzker by at least 10 points, and it's really not that surprising. Pritzker put out ads during the Republican primary to ensure that he would have Darren Bailey as an opponent precisely because he's a radical Republican rather than a broader representation of the Illinois electorate. And it's also worth noting that Darren Bailey himself has an impetus to be more radical even if it risks him in the general election. His opponents and his supporters were pushing for a stronger and more supportive Republican character to run in the election. They want somebody who will fight for them for their beliefs, flawed as they are. And that motivation likely means that Bailey cannot afford to moderate himself in a way that would make him comport himself to a general electorate. And unfortunately for him, and thankfully for the rest of the state, that appears to be the reason he's going to lose by November. In more positive foreign policy news, the Ukrainian government and its forces have begun a counter-assault against the Russian government's occupation of eastern Ukraine with shocking success. The attack, which is taking place in Kharkiv, has provoked immense shock and surprise both by the Russian forces and the world over. NPR Illinois reports that the Russian troops were caught off guard to the point where they abandoned critical infrastructure and materials, including weapons, ammunition, and trucks. Ukraine's military claims that they have gained roughly 1,100 square miles of territory back from the Russian Federation's forces and secured more than 40 settlements. Still, before the Russian forces withdrew, they attacked power lines and critical infrastructure to cut off power to civilians, according to the Ukrainian government. The British Defense Ministry has also said in an update that the Russian forces have found that some of their men have been fleeing by taking up civilian clothes and abandoning their positions. Additionally, they have been stealing bikes, cars, and any other form of transportation they can find from the Ukrainian populace to escape the Ukrainian counteroffensive as people desert. It's worth noting that some of these people are not fully trained Russian soldiers, but instead are conscripts from poorer regions in the Russian Federation, which would explain the dissolution of their discipline. On Wednesday, the Ukrainian government announced the city of Izium has been liberated from the Russian forces, and Zelensky traveled in person to see the frontline city for a ceremony. Now, it's worth noting that this good news is, of course, incredibly welcome. Anybody who has any respect for the sovereignty of nations would understand, I think, that this was a good thing for a person or country to defend itself from an imperialist aggressor. However, I want to caution people not to buy into too much much of the hype. Yes, the Ukrainians are, in fact, doing very well in their defense of their country, and they are doing far better than we initially anticipated because of some of the Russian propaganda about how powerful their military was. But it's worth noting that this is going to continue to be a bloody and brutal conflict. Vladimir Putin and his leadership around him are not about to just back down because they're suffering some minor defeats. Russia has been very clear that it is perfectly willing to throw its troops into the slaughter if it gets them an inch. And it isn't surprising to me that there is some element of the Russian government, including Putin himself, that are denying that they are retreating, but are instead regrouping for further operations. And I'd also like to say there will be incidents where it's not going to be a pretty nice occupation that's going to have to be taken over really easily. There is still going to be issues with former collaborators, individuals who sided with the Russians at the expense of their own country, and we're really going to have to keep an eye on that kind of problem in terms of how the Ukrainian military deals with it. One thing I think we need to be careful of is, like, in our support of Ukraine, we aren't critical of some of the ways they may handle people who betrayed their country. We do not want summary executions in the streets of the Kharkiv region. We do not want people, losing all their property in their homes. We want fair and honest trials. If we are to prove that Ukraine is in fact a better state than what the Russians put forth as a representation of them, we have to hold Ukrainian officials accountable the more power they take. And so long as we do that, I think we can continue to support Ukraine in a moral and acceptable fashion. All right, we've got a great show for you all today. After the break, I will be speaking with Dr. Matthew Geras about the midterms, how they've changed, and how likely it is that the Democrats will be able to retain political control of the Senate and possibly the House. Stick around. Hello, everyone. I'm sitting here with Dr. Matthew Geras, a professor of political science at the University of Illinois Springfield and one of the teachers of the campaigns and elections classes that I have had the pleasure of taking. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Connor. Thanks for having me.
So today I wanted to talk to you a bit about the midterms, kind of what we can expect from, the turnout, the issues of like multiple candidates, either supporting Donald Trump or making him the center of the midterms as a problem for the Republic, but also a push by some more progressive candidates to kind of try and change the state of the Democratic Party at large. So to start us off, I wanted to kind of ask you, what are your general understandings of what is the general narrative that you've kind of heard, you've kind of seen or observed about the midterms? Because from my perspective, it seemed like the Democratic Party was in a massive mess until recently a stream of bills were passed that not only show that the Democratic Party can actually govern, but actively is willing to take action on issues that are important to not only like young people, but the American people at large.
Yeah, so I would say if you had asked me this question a few months ago, certainly a year ago, the kind of general consensus among election observers and political scientists was that it would be a very good election year for the Republican Party. And part of that is just the cyclical nature of our national elections, where it's very common for the president's party to lose seats and often even lose control of Congress during midterm election cycles. And we call this the presidential penalty. And the explanation for why the president's party typically loses seats in midterm elections varies. Some of the explanations pertain to voter turnout, that just the voters who participate in a midterm election are different from the voters who participate in the previous presidential election. Another explanation more relates to persuasion, particularly among more moderate or independent voters who kind of change their opinion of the president after they begin to govern and after their political party begins to govern. But as you mentioned, more recently, this idea of it being a really positive or strong year for the Republican Party has kind of changed, I think most significantly since the Supreme Court decision concerning Roe v. Wade, and that has energized the Democratic base and Democratic voters. And now we're kind of in this current period of time where the chances are the Republican Party will still probably gain seats and maybe even take control of the House of Representatives, but it's looking like that the gains we would have expected a month ago or a year ago are going to be much smaller. and the Democratic Party may actually maintain control of the Senate.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've kind of noticed is not just online, but in like interactions with people in the political science department as well, is that there is this attitude that finally the president that we voted for is actually trying to govern. There's been a lot of memes, discussions, statements that, Joe Biden can't even get up to speak. But recently he gave a speech in Philadelphia where he was not only emphatic of his position that he will do everything in his power to enact reforms, but he basically made the statement that, the Republican Party, at least the MAGA Republicans, are a threat to democracy. And I was wondering, what role does that kind of rhetoric play in terms of galvanizing Democrats, not just say around abortion, but around defending the republic itself?
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple interesting points there. First, is as far as lawmaking or getting things done is concerned, I think Joe Biden or President Biden is in a similar position that past presidents have faced, where when they're elected to office, they often are elected with unified control of government. And they're very optimistic in the sense that they call for bipartisanship and they call for the bridging of partisan divides. But then when it comes down to it, they find it's easier said than done. Now, Congress typically is more bipartisan than the media or narrative covers. But at the same time, we have seen some of the most prominent goals that Biden and the Democratic Party have tried to enact. Most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, which pertains to environmental reforms, has been passed up along partisan lines. We already kind of discussed how abortion has kind of become a prominent issue that has motivated the Democratic Party. And I think you point to the second major theme that is shifting this trend of being an election that's very strongly in favor of the Republican Party to more of an even field, and that is the continued presence of former President Trump in a leadership role within the Republican Party, and by extension, the continuing and still prominent claim of the big lie, or that the 2020 election was fraudulent.
Yeah, and I kind of hit off on that. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that even though you've got candidates within the Republican Party that are more pro-Trump, more willing to promote the big lie, winning quite a bit, there is also this sense that Trump carries some political liabilities because of his rhetoric. Last poll I read, I believe it was Morning Consult, but I may be wrong, said it was somewhere around 32 to 34% of Republicans want Donald Trump to run for president again, whereas DeSantis and several others have posed as alternatives, that they have been assigned that, there is in fact a Trumpist political approach, but that they are also acknowledging that, hey, this might backfire on us. And I was wondering, what role does that kind of hesitation to deploy Trump, so to speak, play in, how Republicans are reacting to, what they've seen in the shift in the midterm election?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think especially among the Republican leadership, so Mitch McConnell, particularly is who I think of when you ask this question. I think there's a segment of the Republican Party who would kind of like to see Trump leave the national stage and kind of leave the Republican Party as its figurehead. But the challenge that they face is that the voters don't necessarily agree with that, or at least a segment of Republican voters don't necessarily agree with that. So Mitch McConnell and other Republicans are kind of in this position where they are both trying to distance themselves from Trump and trying to distance Trump as the leader of the Republican Party, but they're trying to do so without actually losing any of his supporters.
And that seems like an untenable position to be in. On the one hand, you have to legitimize the man that you're trying to remove from politics, while at the same time appeal to people who, for all intents and purposes, never liked him. One of the things that I think needs to be hit on is on average, Trump never had an approval rating above 50%. 538, flawed as it is, has done analyses that show that generally speaking, he stayed under the 50% mark. And most presidents don't get above 50% all the time. But still, usually they peak over that. And so I think, at least from my position, it seems that what we have is a president that wasn't necessarily popular, was never had a mandate, so to speak, to achieve political and social power, but has still remained attached to one of the larger political parties and is kind of hurting them in a way that they didn't previously anticipate. But to kind of shift gears a little bit, but still stay on the Trump issue, with the recent search of Mar-a-Lago and the revelations of classified documents being, held illegally at Mar-a-Lago, I would imagine that this would probably exacerbate the frustrations that the Republicans have with Donald Trump and how it kind of gives more rhetoric for the Democratic Party to use.
Yeah, I think so. I think that probably less so than some of the other, the January 6th insurrection and some of the scandals or stories about President Trump. I think this one is seen as a little bit less partisan in that, it's still partisan, but less so in terms of maybe changing voters' minds, because again, it relates to national security. And you have seen some kind of Republicans not be as supportive of President Trump as they had been in other instances.
And to kind of move on to some of the more predictive measures of what we could see in the election, I was kind of wondering what your thoughts are on the relationship between high rates of inflation and the dropping prices of gas. For a long time, one of the big things that people were worried about, particularly within the Democratic Party, was how are we going to sell a message if all we're doing is telling people why the president doesn't control gas prices? And while that argument still remains a part of it, I wonder how, Democrats are now pointing to the gas prices and saying, look, they're going down, and how that has worked out in their favor. Because to me, people are still in some areas complaining about the gas prices, and it's not always gone well when discussing it.
Yeah, so certainly economics, we as a country or as a voting base in American politics, we tend to blame the president and the president's party for the economy, when the reality is that they don't have nearly as much control over the economy as we might think or might want to believe. And that's certainly one of the reasons that normally goes into explaining why presidents lose seats in midterm elections. And I think that's certainly I think inflation is probably one of the biggest factors that is going against the Democratic Party in the upcoming election cycle. Now, we have seen at least gas prices kind of decline in prices over the weeks. And so I think the Democratic Party is hoping that in some of the improvement in inflation, particularly among gas prices, along with some of these other issues such as the big lie and abortion, that's going to be able to overcome some of the challenges that the economic conditions present the party.
Yeah, and to kind of, actually, I'd like to go back a bit to the distinctions between the inflation and gas prices. To me, I still occasionally hear Republican commentators, both independent and established, talk about gas prices as if they're still up as much as they were. And what I think we've both noticed is there is an element of somebody talking about something, saying something, and that it being not true, and yet repeating it anyway. And with conservative media expanding with different social media sites, different podcasts, and things like that are sometimes repeating these misrepresentations, I was wondering, do you think that even though the gas prices are technically going down, do you think that Republican media, Republican outlets will be able to kind of spin, or at the very least appeal to specific instances of gas prices not going down to kind of hide the fact that they are, in fact, declining?
Yeah, so this is kind of relates to politics and campaign messaging more broadly. But I think kind of the story that you're getting at is we're looking at gas prices now in comparison to when. So if you say in comparison to a week ago, they're probably looking, or a month ago, they're probably looking pretty good in terms of what the Democratic Party would like them to, and how the economic conditions might affect the midterm elections. But if you say gas prices compared to a year ago or compared to 6 months ago, you might kind of get a different story. And I think your point about campaigns and candidates kind of telling or sharing the narrative that fits like what will advantage them is common in politics on some other issues as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing that kind of concerns me is a lot of our media outlets are, our approach to discussing politics is somewhat limited by, this person says this person says this, and then there's maybe a fact check. So to some extent, it's kind of our media outlets don't actually look at policy a lot. Instead, they look at like campaign messages and the rhetoric surrounding those campaign messages. And in our class and in our discussions in the past, we've been required to ask this question, like, do campaigns matter? And, the midterms are coming up pretty soon. It's not far away. And for a long time, these arguments about the dilapidated Biden administration have played a significant role in how people have talked about him. So even with the improvements we've seen from the Biden administration, the willingness to fight, do you think it will matter? Or do you think that it will just, the old arguments will just stick?
Yeah, so I think it matters in the sense, typically when we ask that question of whether or not campaigns matter, we're talking about the vote choice or outcomes of specifically general elections. And you're right, to some extent, these economic trends and the cyclical nature of our elections, such as like the presidential penalty and midterm elections, they typically are pretty influential and pretty powerful. Another common trend that makes like the actual like campaign messaging and campaign strategy a little bit less important are the fact that so many congressional districts are safe for either one political party or the other political party. So where we look and see campaigns mattering most is in these more competitive or marginal seats. And I do think that the changing campaigns and like whether it be messaging pertaining to abortion, whether it be economic conditions, I do think that these things will matter in the sense that I don't think that I do think, like, if we look at election forecasts right now, I looked at 538 before logging in here, and I think they still have basically give the Republican Party about a 70% chance of winning control of the House of Representatives. But where I think it matters is, like, are they going to win the House of Representatives with a 5-seat margin, a 10-seat margin, or a 15-seat margin? I think that's where we really get into some of this rhetoric about abortion and policy decisions and policy public opinion about abortion and the big lie, where I think that's really where this is going to come into play, where it might not be enough for the Democrats to maintain control of the House of Representatives or gain seats in the House of Representatives, but it might be enough for them to lose fewer seats than we might have expected, again, 6 months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, and like to an extent, it's not dissimilar. I mean, it is distinct from the 2018 midterms, where Democrats thought that they were going to have a massive wave of support and that they would take the House and the Senate in the manner that was like significantly larger, with the larger share of the seats. But in the House, they ended up losing some seats and they lost their majority there, lost a portion of their majority there. And in the Senate, it was so close that you ended up having two senators, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, sabotaging a lot of the political momentum that came out of one of the most historic elections in terms of voter turnout in recent history. But to kind of turn towards specifics, in the state of Georgia, we have Raphael Warnock running against Herschel Walker. And as perhaps contradicting my previous statement about the importance of rhetoric, Herschel Walker is not exactly a great communicator. He's not exactly the best speaker compared to Raphael Warnock. But at the same time, we've seen polling numbers suggest that Warnock is down somewhere between 1 and 2 points to Walker. And to me, this is surprising because, well, not too surprising because the presidential penalty, but also it's a bit surprising because there was a lot of investment in Georgia to get people out to vote, to keep it for the first time turning the state blue in a very serious manner. And I was wondering, what are some of the factors that have kept Herschel Walker, running, making him an effective and efficient threat to the Democratic Party's control of that seat? and what mechanisms, if any, Democrats can use to kind of turn the tide?
Yeah, so I think the trends that are making this election really competitive are the ones that you've kind of brought up before and that we've been discussing before. Just the nature of this election cycle, since it is a president's party in his first midterm election cycle, and the economic conditions in the country, I think those are still the biggest factors that are keeping not only Walker but other Republicans and other close races competitive and maybe even slightly advantaged in terms of some of the polling. And that just kind of goes back to the question you asked earlier about do campaigns always matter? As far as the questions that might kind of turn the momentum towards the Democratic Party, I think you can go back to abortion, the big lie, and another kind of point that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell made at different points throughout the election cycle is this idea of candidate quality. And political scientists, when political scientists in political science research talk about candidate quality, they're most of the time talking about whether or not a candidate has previous experience serving in elected office. And in a lot of ways, this makes sense that to measure candidate quality in this way. One, if someone has won an election in the past, they're probably in a better position to be able to win a future election. And two, if they've previously held elected office, that might give them actual experience when it comes to governing. But it's also a rather broad definition of candidate quality, because basically being an unexperienced candidate means lots of different things. This includes things such as former President Trump, who came from the business background. It also includes positions such as like teachers and scientists. So using this broad definition, where I think Mitch McConnell was referring to candidate quality, he was also saying that certain candidates might have scandals or track records that aren't as appealing to voters as maybe other non-quality candidates. And I think particularly in the case of Herschel Walker, he has kind of had some instances in his past, or scandals, so to say, that have will work against him in the long run. But it was not enough to work against him and some other candidates in Republican primaries, at least in this election cycle.
Yeah,
and some kind of had to do with former President Trump's support. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. I actually, to kind of contrast that to Pennsylvania, we have like Dr. Oz versus John Fetterman. And what I find interesting about this is this race looks a lot more likely that it's going to be in Fetterman's favor. Yet, you've got somebody with name recognition who's endorsed by Trump. And yet he has just as many mistakes in PR and his approach, and yet he's not getting the Herschel Walker treatment where it's much closer. I was wondering, what are some of the distinctions that you find in those two races that could explain why Herschel Walker is having a better time as a candidate despite his lackluster quality when compared to, say, Dr. Oz?
I think the biggest, obviously, difference we can point to is the difference in the electorate, that there just might be something that maybe not Republican primary voters, but maybe Pennsylvania voters in general are less accepting of Trump and Trump-backed candidates in the general election than are the Georgia electorate. So that's one trend that we can certainly point to. And then I think the other aspect that we can get to is that sometimes campaigns do matter, and not just the campaigns of Oz or Herschel Walker, but also the campaigns of the Democratic candidates. And I think one of the factors that ultimately elected Raphael Warnock to the Senate in the past election cycle was that he ran an effective campaign and he had effective advertisements. And one thing that was helping him when he won his special election was that race was very nationalized, in the sense that it was like, when we got to the final general election or the final special election, it was the only race taking place. So that might have benefited him in terms of Democratic support in an area that historically has been more Republican leaning.
And kind of bounce off of that a little bit. I do think part of the issue in the case of Dr. Oz is not, well, obviously the electorate's very different. No two states are alike, but also the fact that he is a carpetbagger, for lack of a better term. a lot of the attacks by Fetterman have been, you're from New Jersey, you don't, and he's kind of failed to adapt some of the lingo of Pennsylvania, and that kind of rhetoric has kind of made Fetterman's point. But one of the other things that I think is interesting is the use of the internet and social media. One of the questions we've asked in our campaigns and elections class is this idea of social media making campaigns not as important. But it seems to me that in that case, it's actually being an extension of a campaign's message while also making a strong progressive position a lot more appealing to the electorate. And I was wondering if you thought that played a major role, or if that was just a side effect of the electorate itself.
Yeah, no, I think social media is one of the changing aspects of our campaigns and elections. And I don't necessarily think social media is an argument for campaigns not mattering. I think it's, like you said, it's a new way of campaigning. And in some cases, it's made candidates who historically might not have been competitive more competitive. So as I mentioned earlier, political scientists typically measure candidate quality as whether or not someone has had previous elected experience. And one of the factors that has made the incumbency advantage less powerful in recent election cycles, and also this measure of previous political experience or not previous political experience less effective in most recent election cycles, is that some campaigns are really effective on social media and they're able to overcome any disadvantages they might face.
Well, I'll give you one last question, since I know you have to go soon, but I was wondering if you could give us kind of your final prognosis of the chances of the Democrats controlling the Senate and the Republicans controlling the House. It seems there has been a question in the New York Times recently over whether or not we're making the same polling mistakes as were made in 2016. Some of the same states that are seeing some massive improvement for Democrats also are the same states that suffered from a massive overemphasis of Democratic control. And I was wondering, do you think that this surge in support for Democrats is the result of the same mistakes, or do you think it's an extension of just people being nervous about 2016 happening again?
Yeah, so I think I think your point about the polling error is important, because when we talk about control of the Senate, we're really looking at about 5 or 6 really competitive races. So a polling error or a mistake in one state could swing the control of the Senate. And the reality is whichever party controls the Senate after the 2022 midterm election cycles, they'll probably be controlling the Senate with either 51 seats, or in the case of the Democratic Party, it might even maintain the status quo of a 50-50 divide, with Vice President Harris casting the tie-breaking vote, and by extension giving the Democratic Party the majority. I think I think one encouraging sign for Democrats is that when one common indicator of kind of which way the electorate is leaning is what we call the generic ballot, which is not asking about, do you want Herschel Walker or do you want Raphael Warnock to win the Senate election? It asks, if you were to vote in Congress right now, would you vote for a Democrat or a Republican? And basically, all through all of 2022, the Republican Party has been ahead on this generic ballot question. But basically, since the beginning of August, we've kind of seen it swing in the Democrats' direction. And currently, I looked at one this morning, and one indicator was that Democrats might be leading on this generic ballot by about a point. And since again, this is like more of a national poll, we might be a little less concerned about the polling error in any one location. But like you said, I think the polling error is a potential concern. So just another example is in the most recent election cycle, the Democratic Party thought that they had a realistic chance of winning the Maine Senate seat against Susan Collins, and Susan Collins ended up winning re-election in a relatively uncompetitive election. And just, you kind of asked me my perception. I'd say if we go with the forecasting, I think right now the consensus would be that what you said, that the Democrats would control the Senate and the Republicans would control the House after 2022. And I think that's a pretty, I think that's where I would tend to predict right now as well. And part of that is because with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House, that kind of gives them this advantage where for the Democratic Party, 50 seats is the majority, where the Republicans need to really get to that 51.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. You are always welcome back on. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. This will be uploaded on my podcast this Friday, and will also be uploaded on the YouTube channel and my website, progressive-american.com. Thanks again for joining me.
Thanks for having me.